Muy bien, empezamos con la conferencia inaugural de este congreso. Hemos invitado a Surya Monro, de la Universidad de Huddersfield. Ella es profesora de Sociología y Política Social allí. Es experta en el campo del género y la sexualidad, especialmente en las cuestiones LGTB. Ha publicado diversos trabajos en relación a ese tema, políticas de género, ciudadanía, activismo y diversidad sexual. Junto con Diane Richardson, otra experta en la materia, publicó Sexualidad, Equidad y Diversidad. Y finalmente, el pasado 2015, publicaba un libro titulado Bisexualidad. Además, también ha estado muy cercana a las cuestiones trans y nos presenta una ponencia inaugural en torno a los debates clave en relación a la equidad en las políticas LGTBI, en la que va a abordar algunos temas que creo que están sobre la mesa en los debates que tenemos en nuestro contexto local en los últimos meses, como son la lucha de la LGTBI-fobia en los contextos locales, desde las administraciones locales, los marcos legales y las dificultades para implementarlos, las transformaciones que ha vivido el movimiento LGTBI en los últimos años y la cuestión de la interseccionalidad en estas políticas. Va a hacer una presentación de en torno a los 45 minutos y luego abriremos un turno de debate, comentarios y preguntas con la sala y esperamos no llegar muy tarde a la pausa. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Surya.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this wonderful conference. And it is so wonderful to see so much good work happening here in Catalonia, such pioneering work, and also to have it in this wonderful building. So today I'm going to talk about LGBT equality policies, key debates. I'm going to focus on the European level. I'm also going to talk about various theoretical concepts that hopefully may be useful to people working in this area. Just very quickly, so that you know that I have actually done work in this area, I'm going to quickly talk about some of my projects. I've been working in this field for about 20 years now, a bit frightening, but there we are. My first project was about transgender politics. That was my PhD. I then did some work around lesbian and gay equalities in local government with a colleague, Davina Cooper, which was quite pioneering at that time. It was quite early. And then moved on to a bigger project with my colleague Diane Richardson, looking at LGBT equalities in local government. And that is really the project that has brought me here today. I've also worked for the Fundamental Rights Agency on a large project, a very large project, about the role of public authorities in supporting LGBT equalities. So I'd like to very much acknowledge the Fundamental Rights Agency for their incredible study and for involving myself and my colleagues in that. I've also done work for the Equalities and Human Rights Commission in the UK around tackling hate crime as one of a representation of community organisations. So I've had some hands-on experience as well as activist engagement over the years of various types. These are the main publications of these. The first one was mostly about transgender. The second one is the one about local authorities and local government work that might be of interest. And the third one is about bisexuality, because it became obvious that there's a real gap in knowledge about bisexuality. So that's a brief introduction to my work. Now, as I said, I want to look at the European level in order to provide a context. Now, here it's wonderful, there's obvious real interest, enthusiasm, commitment at all levels for this area of work. That's unfortunately not the case right across Europe. And I want to look at some of the challenges just to set the context. I also want to bring in some debates from social and political science to help us to think about work at an everyday level in terms of activism and policy interventions and practice. So I'm hoping to provide something useful for everybody. I might fail, but I hope to be useful. I am focusing on Europe, not other parts of the world here. I am focusing on public officials and professionals. I don't really manage to include intersex rights here, unfortunately, but what I will say is that it varies very widely across Europe, from the very progressive situation in Malta through to England, where really not very much has been done. So there we are. Now, in terms of the structure of the talk, I'm going to talk first of all about the main challenges overall to work in this field, then the challenges for people working at a local level. Then I'm going to bring in some bodies of academic work. The first one is about organisational change. The second is about intersectionality issues. The third is citizenship issues, which many of you will already know anyway. And I am aware that we do have other academics in the audience and people who engage with academic theory. And then I'm going to conclude. Am I going too fast? No. Okay. So, the overall challenges. You'll be aware that there are still very high rates of hate crime and harassment in countries across the EU, and also some in Spain. So 26% of LGBT people have been attacked or threatened in the last 5 years. That's obviously not acceptable. There are issues around basic safety, particularly for trans people, transgender people, but there have been homicides, murders of gay and lesbian people as well, and probably bi people. So this is a real issue, fundamental safety. We mustn't forget this in all of the other work that we do. There are major issues in a range of other sectors, everything from housing for same-sex couples, through to employment, discrimination in the workplace, through to problems with bullying in schools, which I know has already been discussed today, major problem. So issues of misrepresentation in the media and so on. Now, underpinning this, of course, we have the problem of prejudice. It persists, unfortunately, and linked with that, the lack of awareness, which I know that you're all very aware of. But this is really one of the fundamental problems. And also, in looking at the research, there are issues with some faith-based prejudices, unfortunately, and also traditionalism that has a national flavour. And, of course, the role of political opposition, where that is the case, which I know is not so relevant here, but it is relevant in lots of other places. So to give you some examples from the Fundamental Rights Authority report, which has just come out and has just been presented in the European Parliament, we have quotes, for example. This was a big qualitative survey across 19 EU member states with over 1,000 respondents from public officials, people working in education, in hate crime prevention, and in healthcare. So we had people saying things like, we did not get the LGBTI policy there. That was a thoroughly political choice. As I understand it, there was some lobbying. So basically, national level politicians blocking initiatives that are presented at a local level. In Hungary, we have a public authority representative saying, simply, the social intellectual context is not mature enough for this. And then we have examples, that's political blocking. Then we have examples of overt homophobia and misunderstanding. We have this public authority representative at a national level saying, in a relationship between two persons of type lesbian or two persons of type gay, the aim is strictly emotional without any purpose. It is rather bizarre, and it happens so many times that a gay family adopts a child. Yes, maternal love is something else, even though in a relationship between two gay persons, one is passive and the other is active. So we can see a whole bundle of unfortunate misconceptions and prejudices here. And in case you think this is only Hungary, no, this is not true. We have prejudices, unfortunately, right across a range of different countries. So, at a more local level, the challenges at a national level, as I've said, the lack of political support, lack of LGBT visibility. Now, this is very major. It came up again and again. The vicious cycle of a lack of visibility for LGBTQI people, and then, of course, the politicians and the public authority representatives say, well, there's no evidence of need, we don't need to do anything. And then, of course, the situation is hostile, so LGBTI people feel they can't come out, and then there's a lack of visibility. So this is a real problem. There are also difficulties with implementing equalities and rights legislation and policy frameworks, which many of you will be aware of, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on, and also institutional barriers. A lack of resources came up as a very major issue right across different European countries, unsurprisingly. And also the issue of competing rights claims from the population. So obviously in a democracy we have different pressure groups. LGBTI pressure groups will be one of them, but there'll be others that may be oppositional to LGBT rights. So this is a problem for democratic societies to engage with. So we have quotes, for example, as regards European funds, we live in times of economic turmoil, so often good ideas are handicapped by a lack of sufficient finances. Or in the UK, I think in terms of legislative and policy environment, there have been changes. Whether they've had an impact on the lives of LGBT people, I think is more questionable. So we can have the laws, they're not always implemented. And this is a major issue. For top-down driven initiatives, you know, yes, you can have all the policies that you want, but on the ground people might resist them or ignore them. And in Slovakia, one of the people in the ministerial office said, unless there's a binding resolution or other kind of policy document that would charge the state administration organs with concrete tasks and activities, then allocation of resources becomes virtually impossible. So, you know, obviously that's not the case here. You have the policies, but in countries where that's not the case, it's difficult to do work. So policies are very important, even if they're difficult to implement. Now, for those working at a local level, the first is the perceived sensitivity and embarrassment associated with LGBT issues in some countries. The issue of deeply held prejudices. And then you get the direct blocking of the work by people working in public authorities. You can also have a more indirect blocking of work where there's simply people don't do the work. There's a lack of commitment. There's a lack of buy-in. Then there are the kind of operational issues to do with problems with organisational structures, conflict with organisations or organisational change that hasn't been properly implemented, that kind of stuff. Now, there's also the lack of capacity in the activist sector or the volunteering community sector. Activists get very keen, very engaged, but then, of course, because they're not always paid or because they work very, very hard, they get burnt out, they drop out. And, you know, then if the government's wanting to engage with the community, there's not enough capacity to meet that. And within the activist sector, there are issues of loudest voices. So not all activists manage to get heard by local authority actors. So, drawing on the organisational change project that we did in the UK, an example of silencing in local authorities is we don't talk about being gay, we don't talk about gay rights, we don't talk about different races. In other words, we don't really want to know about equalities because we're all so perfect and we don't have any issues. Okay. Now, we know this is not true. So we get other things. People reporting that initiatives were blocked. We were doing the work, but the politicians told us to stop. So that obviously makes it very difficult to do anything. And then we got one officer saying, well, I did this report on what we needed to do about LGBTI rights, and the report came back with all the mentions of LGBTI basically rubbed out, lines drawn through them. The quote. So, what do we do about this? We can draw on human relations theory, where there's a focus on organisational cultures. Now, it's all very well having the legislation and the policy documents, but unless you have organisational change that supports LGBTI equalities, then not a lot will happen. So, human relations approaches look at the way organisations are composed of informal structures, and as such, the operation of organisations owes more to group norms and values than it does to structures and procedures. So then we need to look at these norms and values and ways of changing them, and it's important to tackle bias and unconscious bias in particular. Now, we see this happening in lots of different ways, positively. across different organisations. So, for example, from the FRA project, we have a school counsellor who's saying we try to raise people's awareness of LGBT issues by organising lectures and discussions. So these things do arguably change the norms of organisations. If there's enough exposure to LGBT issues, they get normalised. This is very positive. So we see this in municipal levels by things like the symbolic initiatives, support for Pride, the senior role models, senior politicians coming and supporting LGBT rights, all of that kind of stuff, but also through training. So with organisational development approaches, people actually go through a process of cognitive change. They highlight the negative beliefs, the wrong perceptions. These get disrupted and challenged, and then people move towards something that's more positive, that's more inclusive and diversity positive. This can be really uncomfortable, and this is really where the phobia bit of homophobia, transphobia, biphobia comes up. Some people are actually scared because they've had ideas, maybe in their childhood, about, that homosexuality actually really is wrong. And those ideas need to be challenged, but they exist at a very deep level. So that's where these organisational development approaches can be very useful. It can be through training, but it can also be directly. It might not get to those deep level prejudices, but it will challenge people. So a senior manager said, for example, in England, somebody else made a stray comment about gays, a negative comment, and I just said, that's not on. So it can be challenged directly in day-to-day work, not just through things like, intensive training. We need our performance and implementation frameworks as well. Organisation change won't happen without deep cultural change, but you also actually need the structures to put those in place. So I won't read this whole long quote out, but basically we need leadership, we need effective structures, institutions, visible and engaged activists, champions for LGBT people, committed professionals, all of that. And in this quote, they're talking about how when adult social services care for people who are elderly or have physical disabilities who need care, you have to make sure that you're very sensitive to that person's sexual identity if you're delivering personal care. So, intersectional issues. I'm moving on to a completely different block of theory now. So we've talked a little bit about organisational change. I'm going to talk about intersectionality theory. I'm giving you a kind of a whistle-stop tour of various bodies of theory. This was developed by feminists of colour, black feminists in America in the late 1980s, 1990s. They look at how our identities are made up not just of, say, gender or sexual identity or nationality or class, but the ways these different things feed through each other to give us all particular and unique positions. So basically, as I've said here, the identities that combine two or more marginalised or stigmatised characteristics. Importantly, these marginalised identities do not just add to each other, but they intersect in particular ways. So why is this important? It's important because those of us who do equalities work, we try to make it manageable. We think about maybe race equalities, we think about gender equalities, we think about sexual identity equalities. There's sometimes a temptation to deal with these as if they're separate. Now, it might be practical to deal with them separately in policies, in local councils, but we need to be mindful that those people within those categories are also from different backgrounds. Some of them are poor, some of them might have disabilities, some of them might be both black and gay. So it's important to think about the complexity, and particularly on the front line, so the people who are dealing with children in schools, young people, young youth services, health provision, that sort of thing. Each person who comes to deal with you will be from different backgrounds, have different things that make up their identity. So there are different types of approaches. I'm using the work of someone called Leslie McCall here. These are a bit unwieldy, the terms, but I will just talk through them quickly. The first one is anti-categorical. Now, this approach, it actually says, well, our identities are socially constructed. they're mostly not inherent. There might be some biological basis to things like gender identity, sexual identity, but most of it is socially constructed. Most of it we can unpack and think about in other ways. Okay, so the category of LGBT, it's a social construct. We can think about other things. We can think about non-binary gender, for example, which makes it all more complicated. Then there's intercategorical approaches, which uses the existing categories of LGBT strategically as an activist thing. And then there are intracategorical approaches, which looks at the ways that people can be multiply marginalised. So, for example, black lesbians. It looks at the particular intersections of marginality. So the first type, anti-categorical. Now, how useful is the category of LGBT or LGBTI or whatever category, whatever form you're using the category in at the moment? Now, these categories are problematic for some people. The first people are those who don't use the terms but engage in same-sex sexual activities or have gender-diverse identities. So, for example, in rural Wales, I was told recently by an activist that, you know, they use Welsh language, they don't use the terms gay. There is no term that is exactly the same in Welsh. So this is in the UK. So it's not very useful. It doesn't represent their identities. Then we have the refugees and the asylum seekers and the immigrants whose identities in their country of origin are different from the terms LGBTI, but they're still engaged in same-sex activities, sexual activities, or they have gender-diverse identities. And then there are the people who are genderqueer or non-binary, who might relate to transgender, but they might not. They might have different types of sexuality from same-sex attractions. So there's quite a few groups that don't really fit very well with the LGBT category. Also, there are people who feel that they have to be closeted about their sexuality. They might not want to actually come out and use those terms, even though they're still relevant. So, for example, in the project that I did about bisexuality, Jackie, a black bisexual, said to me, I really like the acronyms, men who have sex with men, women who have sex with women, MSM, WSW, or MSMW, sorry. You could use these terms in different ways. But anyway, she just says, I can just think about where I grew up. Black men would go to a sauna or a club, they have sex with other men, but they would never call themselves gay or queer. So there might be particular ethnic approaches that really need this type of analysis. And again, somebody called Joe, who's a bisexual and of Chinese origin but living in the UK, said, I have some friends, Catholics, quite conservative, but they're quite kind to me as well. I guess it's Chinese culture in a way. First of all, I never openly say that I am whatever, because first of all, I don't know how to identify myself. This person is non-heterosexual. Secondly, I don't find that I need to come out or whatever. So even for Christians, say some of them don't really like the idea. They reject homosexuality, but they never say something back to me. So there's this kind of sense of like, well, this identity is socially hidden, but also that's partly because the person doesn't actually know what they are themselves. We do need to have spaces for people not to know who they are, as well as to identify proudly as LGBT, which is also incredibly important. So moving on to look at the intercategorical type of intersectionality theory. Now, this is very useful for policymakers because with intercategorical, you can look at the different categories. You can say, right, we need something for lesbians, we need something for bisexuals, they have specific issues and needs, and yes, we need to campaign for LGBTI equalities alongside other types of equalities like race equalities. So an example of good practice or interesting practice in the UK was a local authority officer saying, we monitor how many equality impact assessments have been done in accordance with that programme, a diversity programme. I see every single impact assessment. We've just written our new programme now for the next 3 years. There's nearly 300 assessments there. You know, we've looked at registration of births, deaths and marriages. We've looked at how all of these different things relate to sexual orientation. So there are ways of actually embedding LGBT equalities work in municipal practices in a very practical way. You can also use this type of intersectionality theory to look at different types in specific intersections. So, for example, gender and sexual identity. So in Wales, a local authority officer was saying, I think there'd certainly be a case for tying LGBT issues with gender issues. And this is partly because, of course, LGBT people and women both face patriarchal forces, and there's a need to tackle sexism as well as homophobia. Now, the intra-categorical approach, this is particularly useful for identifying particularly marginalised groups' needs because it looks at those particularly marginalised identities and intersections. So that might, for example, be, a young person who's at home with homophobic parents, who's also got a disability and is poor and can't get to any city like Barcelona that has facilities for young LGBTI people. So this person is particularly marginalised. How do we help them, those of us who are in public service? It helps with activism, this type of intersectionality approach, because you can use it to identify areas of privilege and power as well as marginalisation. So intersectionality also looks at things like class privilege, race privilege. And this is very useful when you're thinking about sexual identity groups, when people sort of say that they are incredibly marginalised, more marginalised than other social groups, and you actually say, well, come on, you're white, you're middle class, you're able-bodied, you can use all of that power to support LGBT rights because actually you have a position of power, you have a permanent job. You can do this safely, other people can't. So it's kind of like, it's empowering for those of us who have some power already to say, well, actually, things aren't that bad for me personally. I can do something useful. And I think it's also important for activist groups, certainly in countries like the UK, to realise areas where they are privileged, because otherwise they end up feeling like victims and it's not very useful. It also helps to identify marginalised groups and silences within the non-heterosexual gender diverse populations. So these are particularly marginalised groups, trans people in general, but particularly people who are non-binary or genderqueer who aren't always recognised by other trans people as having particular needs and issues. Intersex people have been very marginalised, certainly in the UK, although in Scotland there are positive developments. Bisexual people, our research in UK and local authorities showed up that there'd been very little done about bisexuality and that some local authority officers saw it as kind of not really possible to do that work because it was too sensitive. Pansexual people who are attracted to people of more than two genders don't identify as bisexual. So if you're moving towards looking at gender as a continuum rather than just male and female, which some people are, then pansexual is quite a useful term. But of course, women as well, within the LGBT categories, there's a tendency for lesbians and bisexual women to be a bit less visible than gay men and bisexual men. So, an example of a particular intracategorical marginalisation took place this summer in the UK. We had an LGBT History Month. Now, I had a look on the web about this because there's this organisation, it's a very small organisation, Bis of Colour, Bisexuals of Colour. And I wanted to see what they were doing. And I came across this quote. And basically, the individual here is saying it was a mixed month for us at Bis of Colour, Bisexuals of Colour. We sent out over 30 sets of our posters about black bisexual people in history across the country, so that was very positive. But the bisexual erasure from the so-called LGBT groups and organisations was even worse than usual. Camden is an area in London, for those of you who don't know. LGBT Forum refused to host any bisexual events and called them flops, called them disasters. This was without actually having hosted any events. The bisexual communities came out in force, as did the queer, trans and intersex people of colour communities, to support their members. This was in stark contrast to the large funded organisations who say they're LGBT, this is the community and voluntary sector organisations in England, but are often only for gays and lesbians. For many bisexual people of colour, this type of poor behaviour is nothing new. So what we can see here is these are people who are very heavily marginalised because not only are they bisexual, which is a marginalised group within the LGBT acronym, but also they're not white. So they're having to deal with prejudice from both the heterosexual communities, the lesbian and gay communities, but also potentially from their communities of origin as well. So for those people, it's very important, I believe, for people in positions of authority to make sure that they include all of the different groups and not just stick to the ones that are perhaps a little bit easier to get to. So just continuing along the theme of bisexuality, the Fundamental Rights Authority report in 2013, this was a big quantitative survey, found that of bisexual men and women, 47% of women and 36% of men felt they'd be discriminated against or harassed on the grounds of their sexual orientation in the last 12 months. Now, some people think that bisexuals don't really face any prejudice because, well, some people even believe that bisexuals don't exist, which obviously isn't true. But some people think that they don't really face discrimination because they can pass more easily as straight. Now, as heterosexual. Now, some bisexual people do. There are quite a few married bisexual people, heterosexually married bisexual people, who do pass as heterosexual and do escape homophobia. But there's also quite a few who are in same-sex relationships, or who are single, or who are even in multiple relationships, who get lots of stigma. So the issues that bisexuals face are quite different from the issues that homosexuals face, although there's overlap. So that this report found that being out as bisexual doubled the likelihood of discrimination by healthcare providers. That there's also, the research shows that there's double discrimination for both heterosexual and lesbian and gay people. Now, this is different from what lesbian and gay people experience, who experience discrimination from heterosexuals. But bisexuals also can experience discrimination from lesbian and gay people. So it's an identity that is stigmatized in different ways from lesbian and gay identities. And this plays out, for example, in the workplace. So a report by Stonewall, which is one of the big LGBT organisations in the UK, found that there was discrimination in the workplace. Bisexual people are seen as indecisive, untrustworthy, and so on, in a way that maybe gay and lesbian people wouldn't be. So there's a bit of equalities work there to be done. And in my book on bisexuality, Marina, who's a European citizen living in the UK, said it's very difficult. It's very different. It's more difficult. You don't feel included. It's difficult to find a community. It's difficult to find a reference point because bisexual people don't always fit very well into the lesbian and gay scenes, and there isn't usually much of a bisexual scene. You don't fit. For many people, you don't exist. So that's one example of a marginality. Right. So take a breath because I'm going to move on to our last body of theory now. Thank you for bearing with me. I know it's quite a lot of theory first thing in the morning. Citizenship. Who here has worked directly with citizenship models? No. Okay. So citizenship is about our rights, basically. It underpins so much of the work that those of us do who are in the equalities field, or activists, or both. The very early approach is developed in the 1950s, modern citizenship theory, and it looked at social rights, political rights, legal rights. So those are the rights that our state that we belong to have towards us, but they're also the responsibilities that we have towards the state to adhere to the law and so on. Now, out of this came critiques. The first one was the feminist critique, which basically said this tends to refer to male citizens working in the public sphere. What about the citizenship rights of women, the specific rights? But then we also had the critiques coming from people like Geoffrey Weeks and Dan Richardson, Shane Fillane, who said this model of citizenship is very heterosexist. There's lots of sort of assumptions that people are heterosexual embedded within these models. And you see that very much when you look at welfare state provision. Certainly in the UK, there's an assumption that, you know, families are heterosexual, that the women will tend to take the primary role of caring for children in the home and so on. This is embedded in the way that the welfare provision is designed. So critiques of the heterosexist norms of citizenship. I will say that citizenship is absolutely crucial. But there are some limitations to models of citizenship, which I will look at towards the end of this section. So, If we go back to the Fundamental Rights Authority report, what we can see, I mean, it is very important citizenship, but we also see evidence for this embedding of heterosexism within social policies and politics, and also in practice across the different sectors of state provision, school, healthcare, community safety, and so on. So, for example, in Lithuania, a headmaster said, "There's neither gay nor lesbian at the school. Therefore, equality policies are irrelevant." Now, as I've already said, there's a problem with hidden LGBTI populations, which means that people like this headmaster can basically say, well, it's not an issue for us. This is very common that people say this. But what's really going on here is that he's just assuming that everyone is heterosexual, which, of course, is not true. But that assumption is so deeply embedded in his model of what schools should do, what the local population's like, that it becomes quite difficult to challenge that, but very important. We see a similar thing in Austria looking at hate crime. So we've got a head police officer saying the problem generally in Austria, but of course then also in the district, is that this form of crime is not recorded. In Austria, there are no efforts through investigations or surveys or in any other form to record it until now. Hence, there are no numbers, no official experiences regarding this issue. So here again, there's an assumption. He might not be assuming that everyone's heterosexual, but there's an assumption within the way the police collect their figures that everyone is heterosexual, because there's nothing specifically developed for LGBT-related crimes, homophobic crimes, biphobic crimes. So what we see here in this last quote is an example of gender binaried or gender normative citizenship. So it's not just that citizenship models are heterosexist, it's also that they assume quite often that there's only male and female, and that those people were born as male and female. Whereas actually we know when we look at the transgender population that that's not the case. So this doctor was saying there's a reluctance on the part of the Irish medical profession to engage. Irish psychology, it's Irish psychology. People won't deal with it. So it's kind of like, well, if it was something else, like, for example, a physical disability, they would be dealing with it. So what's the problem here? So from citizenship perspectives, we can start to challenge that. We can start to say, well, actually, there are citizenship rights for LGBTI people. We need to be doing stuff to support it. So citizenship's a really powerful LGBT rights tool. It provides overarching frameworks in which so much work can be done. So this is the EU law, this is international human rights commitments, this is legislation, the EU directives, national directives, directives at a local or regional level, but also case law, of course, because people can and do and have successfully taken their governments or their service providers to court to force forward LGBT rights. So, just to read you the beginning of this quote, the principle of equal treatment is a fundamental value of the EU, which ensures both respect for human dignity and full participation on equal terms in economic, cultural and social life, as clearly expressed by Article 3 of the Treaty of the European Union, and so on. So this kind of fundamental bedrock is really what allows all of us in EU countries to do this work. If you look at other parts of the world, quite often that's lacking, even though there are some overarching legal frameworks or policy directives, and so it makes it very difficult at a national level to do the work. So moving on to look at a bit more at the citizenship frameworks, the public officials in both the Fundamental Rights Agency report and the much smaller UK study that I did with Professor Richardson reported the importance of the legislative and citizenship frameworks. So again, looking at the FRA report, just the end of that quote, we've got the number of positive policy developments are taking place to ensure that LGBT persons can enjoy their fundamental rights. And, there are a whole load of different activities taking place to support that, networks, initiatives, and Rainbow Cities is very much part of that. Growth of civil society and, government initiatives to push forward LGBTI human rights. So that's all very positive and very important. So I have here a quote from the Fundamental Rights Agency about your town council. In the Barcelona Town Council, we have looked upwards very much, and to the European Commission has many times been a model to imitate. We have always looked upwards, not downwards. For us, the European Union has been a legal framework or basis from which I think that in Catalonia and Spain we have gone beyond, which is quite evident from what I've already seen here today. So there are initiatives at the local and regional level that are very important, but there's also the overarching citizenship framework within which they sit, which is also a useful reference point. In countries where there really isn't very much work being done, it then becomes a lever to agitate for change. And actually, some of the in the UK now we have quite well-developed equalities work, but actually the initial push for that came from Europe, and people tend to forget that in England, unfortunately. But, you know, it was English activists who went to Europe and said, you know, particularly with the cases of trans rights, the Gender Recognition Act and previous legislation, you know, trans activists went to Europe and, you know, had courses in the European cases in the European Court of Human Rights to push forward their rights, and that then made the government think, right, we've got to do something. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of these international frameworks. And we can also see here in this second quote a kind of a loosening of this kind of heterosexist citizenship. It's not that this individual is saying, right, we should, you know, throw away the heterosexist model of citizenship, because of course heterosexuals need citizenship rights too. It's more that this person is saying, you know, we need to include LGBT people in citizenship discussions. So this public authority representative, who's a deputy head of police in Italy, said, I think the more you talk, the better. The more you write, the better. The more you discuss, the better. So there's this sense of like, these are issues that we need to be thinking about as public actors or as activists. We need to be making it visible. And I think this is particularly important for LGBT equalities because, you know, so often in the past, LGBT people have felt that, you know, we've got to be closeted, we can't afford to be out, la la la. And so there's this need for discussion. And also in terms of dealing with the conflict around maybe faith or nationality, if we can talk, then we can find ways forward. But if there's this kind of suppression of discussion, then that really blocks things. So just to move towards the end of my talk now, there are issues about who's able to claim citizenship rights. So groups and individuals need to prove that they should be recognised by the state in certain ways to claim resources and legitimacy. Now, I'm bringing this up here now because I think citizenship is a wonderful thing, but if you actually look at it, some people are not able to claim citizenship rights, so they might be too poor to take, for example, individual cases to the European Court of Human Rights or to national courts. They might not fit in with the norms or the cultures associated with the LGBT communities. And so on, you know, they might not fit the idea of the ideal gay person. I mean, in England, you know, lesbian and gay identities have become quite normalised now, but people tend to think of kind of affluent, white, middle-class men with nice houses and nice jobs. Now, there's an awful lot of LGBT people who don't fit that. And there are obviously, particularly given the current crisis around refugees and migration, particularly debates about non-EU citizens and migration, people coming from countries of origin fleeing homophobic, sometimes torture or death threats, coming into the EU, capacity of EU countries to absorb them alongside all of the other refugees. You know, lots and lots of issues about that relate to citizenship. And of course, England hasn't been particularly good on that front, I'll say that. So the other thing which I might just want to raise is there's been work by somebody called Yasmin Puar who's talked about homonationalism. Now, this is just a bit of an alert really to some problems, which is that some states make themselves look socially progressive by supporting LGBT rights, and I think I can say that England is one of those, without always being very good about other forms of citizenship. So, you know, they can pursue racialised exclusions, negative immigration policies, or human rights abuses abroad, or even in their own countries, and say, oh, well, we're wonderful and liberal because we've got this fantastic, you know, LGBT rights agenda. So there's that, but then on the other hand, what we see also across Europe is the increases in nationalist homophobia. And this came up very strongly in the Fundamental Rights Authority report, but there's been other research as well to show this. Increases in nationalist homophobia across quite a few European countries, obviously incredibly worrying. And also issues of, at the same time, Islamophobia and racism within some sections of the LGBT communities. Very problematic. So, you know, we've got these conflicts going on which need to be dealt with openly, as far as I'm concerned. We need to make sure that we're inclusive. You know, it's great to have a national or regional LGBT positive identity, but, you know, who are we missing out and why? And there's, I mean, obviously this PowerPoint will be available if people are interested afterwards. These are examples in the UK situation of interesting projects that deal with those groups who might be left out of citizenship, you know, mainstream citizenship, LGBT citizenship. So just to conclude, we have much positive work already taken place. It's fantastic that there's this caucus, this group of people committed here to this work, and that more broadly we've got the Rainbow Cities network across Europe. We have many challenges ahead. Of course, I've focused on the challenges here, not to be depressing, but because I think it's useful to be aware of what we're up against. The ideas from the literature can be useful. So I've talked here about organisational change, about intersectionality and citizenship, but of course there are other areas of political thought, sociological thought that can also be useful. And I know that, you know, here at the universities, much work is going on around that as well. So looking forward to potentially future collaborations around that. I'm going to finish now. I'm aware that lots of you have experience and, you know, maybe have questions. So I'd like to finish. Thank you very much for your patience and for listening.